Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value-creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a Soka researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, my name is Generosa Sangco-Jackson. I am a recent transplant here to sunny LA by way of Indiana and originally sort of Florida. I'm a military kid, so I grew up basically on the East Coast. And I'm really excited to see what's going to happen now that I'm completely on the West Coast.
Wonderful to have you here in sunny California, Generosa. And thank you so much for taking this time to be on my podcast. Very excited to learn more about your background. I didn't really know about the military kid background. I've always associated you more with like Latin language, which I'm also hoping that you get into and speak more about. But we had an incredible 2-year experience in a master's program through Harvard, and that's how we got to know each other. And it's just been so wonderful to connect with amazing educators and individuals who make impact, and also just travel across the country, like in your case, or also around the world. So definitely. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So to kind of kick things off, wanted to pass it over to you and ask you a little bit more about your background as an educator. Also that military background sounds fascinating. That kind of like relocating and moving around. Probably, yeah. How was that like? And anything else you'd like to share? Really, this is just a space for you to reflect.
Thanks. Let me start with the military stuff because that is chronological. My mom served in the U.S. Navy, and there would be times when she, being on a ship, would have to sail out. And so year after year, I might be living with her, or I might be living with grandparents or guardians. It was a pretty transigent kind of life. One of the skills I've gained from it is that I can really Jenga pack a car trunk like you would not believe. And so, this is people may have heard the term military brat. And there's a sort of like lived experience and kind of psyche that goes along with that. We tend to be pretty self-sufficient. We tend to take well to change. But I would say it made for kind of a disrupted um, educational experience. I went to like 5 different elementary schools. The first time I really had an extended experience of being at the same school year after year where I didn't have to make friends. I found it actually kind of strange that I knew everybody matriculating with me was not until middle school.
That sounds very significant, and especially in the sense of like, early development and like, going through elementary school to middle school, you're kind of looking to your peer groups to kind of make sense of where you're at. You're learning a lot from them, also from the environment itself. So, it sounds like while there were some positives, like the
Mhm.
self-sufficiency and like adaptability, the negatives, I guess, would be maybe more geared towards like the friendship circles that you had. Um, could you speak a little bit more about what that sense of like was it a pervading sense of loneliness, or was there other emotions of like excitement, the novelty of it that kind of helped balance you? And also, did you have any siblings?
Oh, I'm not only an only child, I'm an only grandchild.
Wow.
So
Mhm.
that probably makes me pretty spoiled, but it made my family very the family was a little bit more extended, but still kind of nuclear with myself, my mom, my grandparents. So I grew up in a multi-generational household, especially when I got to live with my grandparents. And I
Mhm.
would say you hit kind of the nail on the head that in terms of friendships, it was pretty difficult. Like my best friends growing up were my cousins because I would see them fairly consistently. Um, and now that I'm older and I've moved a little bit more, I had definitely have noticed that I have some difficulty sustaining long friendships. I'm not great at the picking up the phone and writing the letters. So it's something I actively work on. Um,
Mm.
and I hope I'm getting better at it. We'll see.
I think
Um,
so. I mean, we're connected, and now we're
yeah.
kind of like neighbors, like in neighboring cities,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
is amazing considering how extensive and global like the Harvard network is, and then you just kind of
Yes.
plop down into a Los Angeles area, which is always great.
Mhm.
But maybe in terms of like the family connections, though, that sounds
Mhm.
like that was quite robust and very much needed, and the intergenerationality of it also
Mhm.
strikes me as quite unique. Maybe could you speak a little bit about some of the like influential figures within your family, whether that be going back to your mom or anyone else that really
Mhm.
was instrumental in helping you lay your own foundation, maybe not just in the educational sense, but also just in terms of like what you aspired towards.
Mhm. Well, that's also an interesting question because I'm a first generation college student. And so it was really tough to kind of explain to my family what I was doing. I was pursuing basically a Latin degree. We call it classical studies, classical philology. There are lots of names for it, but it's the study of ancient languages, particularly Latin and Greek. And my blue collar grandparents really could not wrap their heads around it. My grandfather worked for GE, my grandmother was a bank teller, and they're like, what are you gonna do with that kind of thing?" Um, my mom was really supportive. She's like, "Look, you're gonna figure out what you'll do, with it down the line." And so, um they were always supportive of me pursuing more advanced education. It was not their experience. So they didn't understand when I told them I was getting a PhD and that's also called a doctorate. They're like, wait, you're going to be a doctor. That's great. And I would have to explain to them, "No, not that kind of doctor. I won't be able to help you with, your heart conditions or anything." And so that sort of became the family joke, she became a doctor, but not that kind of doctor. Um, and it made so I the grandparents I lived with were my mother's um parents, and it made for kind of a tight matrilineal sort of line, because I'm not just the only child, I'm the only grandchild. And it was pretty interesting in how that would work, how sort of tight the three of us became, this sort of intergenerational group. And they just, my grandmother and my mom, they were just sort of the backbones. They were these women of quiet strength and you know what it they were able to show like a lot of perseverance, um and at the same time, a lot of love. And so you know, our parents care for us, right? They raise us, and same thing with grandparents in a lot of ways. And at some point in your life, it flips, and you become the person who cares for them. And so, as I got older, I my mom ended up with cancer, and she was 49. And so I ended up being her caretaker during that time, which was, I mean, nobody writes a book about how to do that kind of thing, right? And we rarely in society talk about it because we don't want to think of losing those bedrocks to our families and our hearts. But we are human machines and we break down eventually, for a variety of reasons. And caring for my mom, there was you know, a really tough time when she was upset. She felt like a failure because, children shouldn't have to care for their parents was her thought. And for me, it was paying back, it was giving her the kind of care that she gave me. And I as hard as it was kind of an honor. And then a similar thing happened with my grandmother. Although she made it into her 80s, and had a whole lot of fun in her last couple of years. But I was there for her, and you know, it, just that perspective, I think, is one I wish we would talk more about. Like there are dozens of parenting books out there, right? Everybody's got the new fad for what to do with parenting. But what about when you're caring, for these people who've been responsible for you their entire lives? So, or your entire life. So, yeah, that was a steep learning curve. And I was in Harvard while that was while some of that was happening. So that's yeah, I felt for we had a lot of moms in our cohort, and I was just like, man, if they've got little ones running around, and if this is my experience with someone that I can actually communicate with, right, who understands what I'm saying to them, um, how hard must it be with the littles that, are just crying and stuff. So, um, but yeah, it's a stage of life we all come to.
Mm.
We all come to be a caregiver, caretaker in some way, shape, or form within those family units.
Mm. Yeah, this is really important, and the strong connections. I think you said like the matrilineal kind of
Hmm.
like you know uh lineup. I don't know
Yeah.
how you phrased it. But there's this unique bond, right? Not only
Hmm.
just within family, but also how like you said that it's all on your mom's side, and I like the way that you described your mom and your grandmother as like women of quiet strength. And because there's nothing, maybe it wasn't like their personality to kind of like be, putting themselves out there or to like garner like attention, or to be overly flashy about anything. But that there was probably some kind of like, understanding of like kind of what their role was, who the people in their lives were and why they were important, and probably, showing up for them. And now the fact that you were able to then, pay that back, in the form of like appreciation and like caring for them. I think you used the word to honor them, or you felt honored doing that. I think is really amazing because it just speaks to how intimate, human connections really are, and that while it can feel very daunting and scary and difficult, it could also be this, really positive, loving, nurturing, and cherished memory, and that these things are not, they're not like mutually exclusive, but they can come together and be, two truths at the same time. And yeah, and so that's really powerful. I'm really happy that you had that experience, and that your family was just very supportive of your overall academic journey, from the beginnings of like, you trying to explain to them what classical education is, and Latin, and then all the way through to a PhD, and then also a Harvard graduate degree. So a lot of education, and actually I kind of want us to maybe, look at that. What got you into the study of something like, Latin to begin with? Because I surely did not have Latin at my school. And I think you're probably one of the first, I think you are the only person I know that speaks Latin, and knows of Latin. And yeah, so like, how do you fall into something like that? Because you said that your mom served in the U.S. Navy,
Hmm.
and so yeah, I'm a little bit, baffled. Like, whoa, how someone do that? So yeah, could you share a
Right.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. My mom actually did have a lot of influence on this because she would bring back stuff, from her travels. And um, I was a kid who became pretty interested in mythology, and she happened to go to Greece, and she brought back these, tchotchkes of gods and goddesses, and books on the constellations. And so I thought mythology in all of its variations was pretty cool. I really enjoyed knowing that stuff. And as I got older, when it came time for high school, I knew that there was this idea of Greco-Roman mythology, and that there was a whole Roman world out there. My very large public high school in Jacksonville, Florida, offered Latin as an elective. And what really sealed the deal was in the guidance counselor's office as we were setting up my schedule. My grandfather, being very blue collar and practical. He said, "You live in Florida. Why don't you take Spanish? Latin, what are you going to do with that?" And so the rebellious teenager kicked in, right? And I was like, well, I'll, go to med school or law school and, I'll be really great at, knowing languages and it'll help on my SATs and stuff. And he sort of threw his hands up. It's like, all right, whatever. Um, but when I got there, I found my people, which is that they're students of Latin, and you're going to hear that kind of again and again and again from them. They find their people. Um, there are lots of different sort of ways to teach Latin. There are lots of schools of thought about that pedagogy, and it sort of has its own kind of set of niche pedagogies because it's not a spoken language. It's a lot of people are like, okay, I've heard of Latin. It's a dead language. I prefer to think of it as fossilized because then when we study it, become these cool paleontologists of language and culture as we dig into it. And while I was in the class, my teacher had a very the pedagogical term is grammar translation. So you learn sort of endings and charts and declensions, how to conjugate verbs, and then you go forward, eventually to read literature. And that's another thing that distinguishes Latin is that in modern language courses, um, there are a lot of students who are there for what's considered survivalist language, like you get to go to the country and you know how to get yourself around. There are people who study more deeply, and that gives them more access. But what is generally considered one of the higher orders of ability is the ability to read literature. Great literature in the native language. And with Latin, you go straight to that literature. Like there's not stuff kind of in between. You don't get you don't get all right, technically Harry Potter in Latin exists. And a couple other books, Winnie the Pooh is another one, but that's a modern rendition of these things. You don't get that. You go straight into epic poetry, or the words of Julius Caesar as he campaigns, and is conquering the world. So you go from, declining to all the way up with that kind of literature. Um, and so there's just something odd and differentiating about that piece so that the Latin students kind of band together. It's just different than learning the other languages, at least in certain methodologies. Well, in addition to that, there are organizations that really support the full learning of Latin because when you learn it, you're not just learning about the language itself, you're learning about the gladiators, right? The culture, the history, the mythology, which is what hooked me. The customs of the era, like how did they do their marriage ceremonies? What were their, what was their engineering like? And look at the amazing things like temples and the Roman Forum that we still have left. So how did those things come to be? So you're getting all of that. Well, a way to encapsulate that, and this is what my really phenomenal Latin teacher, Nancy Allen, did, was she had us participate in something called the Junior Classical League. And a lot of people will call that Latin Club. But it's like so much more than Latin Club because you get your club together, and you've got your elected offices, and you do your events, right? You do your service project, and you do your homecoming parade stuff. But there were other forms of expression and competition within that framework of the Junior Classical League, the JCL, that really hooked a lot of us. We would go like basically like once a month to different schools, and um, we would compete in an event called Kurtamen, which is like Team Jeopardy. And you've got buzzers, and it's sort of a trivia game. And so it's based on sort of various categories, like I mentioned, of the history, the mythology, grammar, translation, all of that. But it fired sort of the instincts of our group where we wanted to study more. We were consuming more on our own. We supported each other in this pursuit of extracurricular knowledge. And that was a culture that I sort of fell into and never came out of. Um, it's actually really cool. And it's something when I became a Latin teacher that I continued. And I've done a lot of volunteer work for that organization. And I found that my students really loved it, and they all found something in there. They found artistic expression, like in there are drawings and paintings. They could do oral events for um like impromptu speaking, and there were costume contests. I mean, athletic events. So at the different levels of these competitions, all the way up to the national level, there was sort of something for everyone to kind of find their niche for what they wanted to explore on their own. And they found sort of their tribe.
Yeah, like you said, right? Finding your tribe, found their people, and it's just fascinating how you're able to shine this like spotlight on this particular community that, you know, let's say call it what it is. It's pretty niche, right?
Hmm.
I'd say not too many people are able to have access to those specific studies, maybe in their immediate hometown, or to have that kind of club environment. I'm sure now though, like there's probably a lot of online forums and ways in which they're doing this Kurtamen, right? This Team
Hmm.
Jeopardy that you were talking about. That sounds great. But yeah, there's I really like the origin story of your interest in Latin because it ties back to your mom, right? Which of course, family super important, but the fact that she was able to kind of like travel the world and bring parts of that back to you, and that really stoked this curiosity, right, within you to like ask questions about like what was it like, in that time period. How did those kind of people, go about their day, and how did they imagine, their traditions and kind of the world building of like mythology part of it. And it seems that for someone like you must have had a very active imagination, right? To kind of like take from that and then just kind of like really engage with it, and then kind of demand more information, right? To kind of really like feed that desire of like kind of yeah, putting yourself in their shoes probably also requires a lot of empathy too, to be like, what was it like to be a person back there? And and so another part that really struck me, from what you shared about Latin, that like most people think of it as like the dead language. And that's how I thought of it as well. That's why I was like blown away at the Harvard commencement that there was some person tasked with reading a speech in Latin, and I was like,
Well,
oh
that
my
he wrote
gosh.
in Latin.
Yeah, wrote it and then spoke it, and I was like, what? But
Mhm.
so it you're kind of pushing back on this notion that it's not a dead language, but you could think of it like fossilized. That's really cool. And then you said like paleontologist. I was thinking of like Ross from Friends. It's like, oh
Mhm.
my gosh. So like maybe Ross would have like liked to learn Latin. That could have been an episode right there. Or maybe it was.
Right.
I don't know. Um, was it? I don't know. There were so
I don't think
many.
so. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But Ross would have been part of our tribe 100%.
Right, yeah, he would just fit right in.
Mhm.
So, the sense of, like, building that sense of, like, that community of learners who really wanted to, yeah, I think as you said, the pursuit of extracurricular knowledge, right? It wasn't that kind of like knowledge that we normally associate with, oh, this is practical. This is what my, grandfather, blue collar worker would associate. Will get you the job. But really, it was this, other side of like the academic kind of pursuit of like just that fulfillment of like, wow, this is engaging, this is stimulating, and this is yeah, helping me to kind of like make deeper sense of the not only like the world that they had inhabited, right, with these mythologies and like these ancient civilizations and peoples, but also maybe have some solid reference point for what about the world that we're living in right now. Is that a kind of conversation that you would have with either the people in the club, or maybe this was on a higher level beyond high school in like college and or your PhD studies, where the learnings from these ancient civilizations and the language played an important role in helping you make better sense of current civilization that we're all a part of, right? So, was there any conversations, or do you have any thoughts about that kind of like bridging effect between back then and right now?
Absolutely. I think what has made me really fall in love with the ancient world and Latin, the Latin language and the Greek language, they're my vehicles to it. Um, it's that these people from thousands of years ago have so much in common with us. There's a Roman poet, his name is Catullus, and he writes a poem um, that says, I hate and I love, right? And the poem is very short. And he's like, I don't know why I don't know why I'm stuck between these two um, strong emotions, but I am. And I'm tortured by them. Like, that's every love song, we've got on the radio. Like, it just speaks to this sort of universal human experience in a way that I just really love digging into, that I wanna read more about and learn more about time goes on. You've got sure, we can go with, you know, Western civilization is built upon sort of these ancient Roman ideals, and the idea of democracy comes out of ancient Athens. We absolutely, those things are important comparisons and evolutions. But I think what I find most fascinating is the poetry where you get feelings you recognize, right? That you have an emotional response that that person was writing about. They can affect that in you. Um, and so I think it's just part of our greater humanity in that regard. And so I guess looking back, it does give sort of a lens, I think, to how I evaluate the current and modern world around me. But I think that's also why I feel it's important to study these things because you're right. It's an unusual thing to study. It used to be common in schools. It used to be part of the national curriculum in the UK. They took it out, they added it back, you know. Um, and you'd be surprised at how many people actually have had the opportunity to take Latin. And I could name drop all kinds of people, but I'll give you one solid example. In the show Loki with Tom Hiddleston, and they show up at the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, he was a Latin student, so he pretty much he wrote the dialogue and spoke it himself and stuff. So you get a lot of people where you'd be really, really surprised that they studied Latin and they found something just formative in it. And the JCL, it at one point, we were competing in membership with the Boy and Girl Scouts in terms of student-led organizations. Numbers are dwindling as education shifts away from Latin because of that pragmatic piece, but we're seeing lots of trends with schools trying to add it back. So we'll see where that goes. The pendulum kind of swings in that STEM piece, swings away from humanities, goes STEM, and then kind of comes back. We'll see where we are in that sway pretty soon, I hope, so that we know. But for me, Latin unlocks all kinds of things, both for you and in you.
Mm. That's powerful. Um, and speaking of powerful, that first poem that you mentioned about, by that Roman poet, I think it was titled "I Hate and I Love." Is that correct?
It doesn't have a title, but those are the first three words. Odi
Oh,
et amo. I hate and I love.
okay. I was just thinking of like, wow, that's like that was like Taylor Swift, like she could totally write a song just called "I Hate and I Love," and I would
I
probably be,
100%
yeah.
would make those comparisons with my students about, Taylor versus Catullus and, how different are these? Or if you were going to, create a soundtrack to Catullus's poems, which Taylor songs would match up with which poems, stuff like that. It's something, there's something just universal about it. They talk
Mm,
about, the ancient poets talk about, well, I shouldn't just say poets, but the authors, they talk about friendship and what that means. They talk
mm,
about duty and honor and what that means.
mm,
How they struggle with it. They talk about, what is there beyond this life, right?
mm,
All of these existential questions, and I use the term existential not just as that
mm,
philosophical terms, but the questions of our existence and how we evaluate it. All of that can be found in these ancient poets. And now I don't want them to sound like super highfalutin. The Romans had, they had graffiti on bathroom walls and everything too. So it doesn't have to be this, oh, super high brow, only the epic poets and only the philosophers kind of approach, right? We have evidence of them scribbling dirty jokes on walls and, those kinds of things. But again, to the human experience, that's a touchstone we can relate to. Um, so I'm just continually fascinated by that by that tie.
yeah, I'm fascinated by it. I'm becoming more and more fascinated. The longer we're having this conversation, because it's so true, right? Like we don't really stop to think, especially on that kind of like a time scale, right? Of like just so long ago. We're talking like what, like 1,000 years ago plus,
Couple, yep.
of yeah, a couple thousand years ago, of just like how these deep emotions, right, that are part of the human experience have been wrestled with, and they were grappling with this, and that actually a lot of the insights that they'd arrived to are things that we can really appreciate in our current milieu, and I think part of that appreciation comes from maybe the value of like wrestling with something as complex as love, hate, or friendship in general, and being like, wow, yeah, it is a challenge and it's difficult, but at the same time, being engaged in that pursuit gives life value, and it's what you make of it. But again, it's like having that reassurance that like people from before us have experienced that themselves. I think that's really, yeah, it's really awesome. I find myself very blown away by that. So the it seems like your interest in like the poetry side of it, and probably even like going into like the philosophy realm as well, are what really ground you, rather than just like the kind of like I think you mentioned this, like the building blocks of civilization and democracy and all of that being true. It just feels so much I don't know, more static, like they were like literal like blocks just kind of put down for civilization, rather than the messiness of, again, our humanity. So the fact that you can bring that into conversation with students that you teach, I think is really really brilliant. And so actually that's a great segue because you've taught for many a year and are quite experienced in the classroom. So could you speak a little bit more about the students that you taught? Like what grade level are we talking about? And I guess my question is, what like at what point did you realize that teaching was your thing, that you really enjoyed teaching?
So I started out teaching high school. I had a first class of freshmen that were, I could call them like scamps and scallywags. I can do that because I'm still in touch with many of them. Um, and a couple of them became Latin teachers themselves. And I have worked with middle school students. Middle school was really my husband's forte. I mean, he can be silly with them, and it took me a while to really get to that point where I didn't take myself in the classroom so seriously. Um, but I think I could go in every day and watch a student's eyes light up with some connection that they made. Like, oh, I finally get it. Or, oh, I struggled with this declension and these charts. Or, I really didn't understand how to study this thing, but I did. And so every kid was finding something valuable, you know, for themselves. Sometimes it was pragmatically valuable. Sometimes it was emotionally or philosophically valuable. And sometimes it was a piece of character um, that they could find, right? Like they stuck with it, or they learned to ask for help, or they found out they themselves could articulate what we were learning to their fellow students and they could be helpful. So all of these little pieces in the classroom, I think they go well beyond Latin. Latin just can be kind of an equalizer because you don't have a lot of people coming into it with prior knowledge. So they might know some stuff, but nobody's coming in with the declensions already in their head um, when they first start it. And so I think that became sort of a point of inspiration, but going through it every day as a group also really built a lot of bonds. Um, I would say, when did I know I was going to be a teacher or wanted to be a teacher? Probably like my third year of teaching. Although people around me would tell me that, I was the one working with students and tutoring them, right? I was like volunteering and doing stuff like that, and I was kind of naturally leaning that way. I just didn't see it for myself, and graduate programs being what they are, I was very fortunate at the University of Florida um, that I was able to grow into the PhD program there, which was new. And so a lot of funding had shown up for those opportunities. And, I helped. I don't want to say I helped. I guess I was in a department, right, where we were watching this sort of go all around us. But at some point, reasonably, funding runs out. And so at that point, I needed something to be able to continue so I could finish my degree. And at the time, the school at which my husband was teaching middle school Latin, they had an opening that I fit right into. And then he and I got to work together, which I will say comes with its ups and downs. It was a good thing we were in separate buildings. Um, but with that, we got to really grow along with these kids that collectively we taught, for 6 years. And that became something really, really special, I think. And that's not atypical of the Latin teaching experience, right? Even in larger modern language programs, sometimes you don't always have the same, instructor. And you you might be lucky enough to have the same one and grow with that person and really learn from them, not just their subject, but, more about the world. W- I mean, we were blessed to teach entire families at one point as students matriculated through. We got to travel with them to Europe for their first, ever international experiences and share that with them. So, um, for a while there was a term that was kind of going around, and lots of Latin clubs picked it up, but it was Latin fam, and just that, again, that concept of finding your people and having these touchstones. I know so many students that from my program became friends with programs from around the state and around the country. And when they got to college, they're like, oh, great, I know so and so here. And, we'll get together and do stuff. And it becomes this, more than a network, I think, but it can be utilized that way. It just becomes this piece of connection.
So yeah, that sounds like an amazing teacher journey because I think like initially from my experience as well, um, it takes a while to really have that identity solidify, to have that belief in yourself be put before you for you to see it for what it is and to like claim it. And it sounds like for you, the first couple of years, I mean, just kind of being thrust into not only teaching, but also in tutoring capacities within the graduate program you were in, you just kind of inevitably found yourself doing the work. And then I think you said like in the third year, then finally you were like, oh, like now you thought you were just kind of like wading through the waters, and then you found out that it was coming up to your hip, and you're like, wow, I've gone pretty deep, and then it's just kind of furthering as you go like from one year to the next, and the communal aspect, the family component that you were speaking of, that's really important because I think when learning anything, especially like with languages, it's fraught with these I don't know, this perception of like how are people seeing me? Like
Mhm.
basically, do people think I sound like an idiot? That at least that's how I got that from like learning other languages like Spanish and Portuguese and Korean, and I would always be so self conscious about it. But
Mhm.
when you're able to have that, like you said, great equalizer of like, hey, like this language hasn't been spoken out loud for I don't know how many years, right? Or like it's like everyone's coming into it with this like this newness that any advancement is exciting, right? And it's just, again that like fossilized remains of like chipping away and just the more you put into it, the more it reveals itself. So that's great. And like, building those relationships over many years, I've also come to find as a teacher that's been most gratifying of all, just knowing. And I don't keep track of all the students because probably there's some students that are like, I don't want to have anything to do with you, Scott, and it's like that's okay. But for those students that I do know, to hear that they're doing well, or better yet, right, have taken up wanting to teach themselves. That the fact that you said that you have some students who went on to become Latin teachers says a lot about the influence that you had on them. And then one other comment that kind of came into my head, and this is a little bit more of a silly comment, but again, thinking of Latin as like a dead, oh no, not dead language, but an ancient language. I always had this perception that like the teachers would be like ancient, like really old. It's like I don't know. I'm just imagining some like really old British white guy just speaking, like holding up a skull and like kind of like I don't know, like Shakespearean fashion and just like speaking, Latin to a class. But especially when you started and still now, right? Both you and your husband, I know Dave, you both exude youthfulness and like, vigor of like, yes, let's learn. So I'm sure that really helped a lot in getting students to not only be interested in the subject, but to remain committed to the study of it. Since, while it's probably fascinating and exciting, it's still a language and it's still going to be very difficult. So I'm sure that also factored into popularity, to have, young teachers who really are passionate about their subject. And so, this discussion that we've been having about, the ancient language of, Latin, and then kind of what it represents, in a way, right? These fossilized remains convey so much deeper meaning and tie back to so many other kind of like artifacts that we can look towards, and then really kind of like pool together to create a worldview. And I also, appreciate that you've already kind of spoken to this kind of like bridging effect between like the past and the current day. Um, but now kind of introducing the concept of the global citizen, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about if that's something that would be applicable within this context, if it's, something that you've thought about either within your class or within your studies, that there might be some relevance there. I'm just curious just to hear your thoughts quickly about that.
Sure. I think the study of these ancient languages gives people a perspective beyond their own. And in many ways, the the fossilized cultures, these dead cultures, give people a sort of safe space to be able to evaluate in, their own selves from that other piece. Because there's always the balance between a cultural existence and an individual one. And so as people look to the past, you know, it can be looked at in almost this might be dangerous territory. I don't want to say things are monolithic because this was a very complicated culture. It's problematic in many, many ways. We're talking about a culture that conquered, cultures that, had very little problems with things like genocide. It's not all the cool gods and goddesses and things like that. I think those lessons, though, are important to look at and can kind of be examined in a more imaginative and um, less real kind of way, instead to look at problems of today that are dealing with living people right there. And I think the concept that we as modern humans have something in common with those ancient and gone humans should translate to mean we have things in common with the other humans around us. Um, it doesn't always, that message doesn't always get across. Um, and I think, the study of classics has been really fraught, um, because it was really started with just an elite sector, right? If you were British royalty, this was expected of you. You would go off to Oxford, Cambridge, and learn these kinds of things. And if you didn't have the means to study this, you it didn't happen, right? Um, so cautiously, right? I think there are many, many lessons to be learned and ways to explore the ancient world that can give people a better perspective and thoughtfulness as we communicate with each other and we learn about one another's cultures, and we're able to sort of like listen and take it in and line it up with our own, and see more how we are all alike. We hate, we love, we laugh. So how can we leverage those commonalities, right, to be
Yeah,
citizens of the world?
well said. I think that there's a lot that you were sharing about the importance of like perspectives, especially when it comes to like the distant past, as a way to kind of glean insight through this examination of what happened in particular segments of time, almost at like a case study, I feel, where it can give you this, opportunity to see what were some of the kind of like outcomes, right? Pathways that were forged, and how did that play out for them? With no judgment, right? Because you're not going to offend them; they're long gone. So that's maybe the safe space that you were talking
Hmm.
about that, gives us a little bit more, I don't know, like it gives us, what's the word? Like we're okay with going forward with it. The word escaped me. I don't know what it is, but yeah. So there's the perspective side of it, and then the commonalities of just like understanding that, in that shared humanity, that there's so much more that we share in common than really what just differentiates us. And I think that's also really in line with, yeah, this notion of global citizenship, really, us being, one human race. That's one thing. With that humanity, that we're all equally desperately trying to understand and reconcile with, and ultimately just live good lives, and to be happy. So I think that's very insightful, and it also makes me really want to continue learning more about Latin. And you're showing a
So,
book. Is this
okay,
is this the book
I am.
recommendation? Okay.
It is a book recommendation. So you said The Good Life, and that is exactly what this philosopher that I adore, Epicurus,
Hmm.
that's exactly what he aspires to. Like, what is the good life? Right? That's what the ancient philosophers are delving into. Does it mean good character? Does it mean living well? Does it mean all of those things? And this is something I've started reading. Um, it's ultimately by Daniel Klein, but he's looking at, you know, w- what does it mean when you're older and you look back? Do you feel fulfilled? And I think that's the true kind of passion project, of studying the ancients, right? How do you get your life to be more good in whatever iteration, and interpretation you want that to be?
Mm. That's awesome. And thank you for that book recommendation. I have a quick thought to follow up what you just shared. Do you think in the same way that
Yes.
we like, or maybe have you ever had this thought that in the same way that really dedicate so much time and effort into like exploring and understanding the ancients, as you said, that, were around thousands of years ago, do you ever think about the future peoples, right? Thousands of years into the future, we'll like look back at what we're doing right now with the same kind of like curiosity. Do you ever think about that?
I do. I'm also a sci-fi fan, so like that fits right in
Mm,
that model. I would hate to call it dystopian, but what are they going to think of when they find these artifacts, or wow, we've uncovered, I don't know, a swimming pool from this culture and we've carbon dated it to the mid 2000s, and oh wait, we found this swimming pool and we've carbon dated it to, you know, not the mid 2000s AD or BCE, but BC. What? I mean, these people must really like swimming if they can identify that it's a pool at all.
what if
So
they come across this podcast? They're like, oh my
I,
gosh, these two had a wonderful conversation about education and Latin and family, and that's awesome.
mhm. So you caught me in an archaeological bias there. I'm like, rocks and urns and stuff. And you're like, no, what we're doing now is an artifact. I
A
like
digital artifact.
digital archaeology is going to be a thing, man.
I've never even thought about that seriously, but that is true, right? I mean, that's so much of like the world that we're building around us, but um maybe not as enduring, I think, as like the actual like kind of rock and like sediment that compounds in the depths of this earth. But still, nonetheless, I'm sure we'll invent something clever to like make it last, because we tend to do that. But that's yeah. So I mean, thank you, Generosa, so much. This has been so thought provoking, given the kind of like, us stretching, our imagination to way back when, ancient civilizations were around, and really, and then, looking into the future as far as like, how will our civilization be looked upon and understood, and what lessons will they live? I mean, like learn, and who is the Taylor Swift of, thousands of years into the future? These are
Mhm.
important questions. Like the people demand answers. But they'll have to wait. But this has been such a joy to have you on the podcast, and I really appreciate you sharing your story. And it's clear that it's not just your individual story, but also story shared with your mother and your grandmother, and that your pursuit for knowledge, and your passion for teaching has really touched the lives of many, many, many people. And I think that's and this is an important niche that needs to continue to be shared and developed as the pendulum inevitably swings the other direction. And so, as we're kind of like closing out our conversation, I just wanted to give you the last words. Any final thoughts before we kind of close out this conversation?
Oh, wow. Um, it's absolutely worth looking into the past to see maybe who we are, and then considering, like you're saying, how that goes into the future, and then just talking about it with one another. This has been delightful, and I mean, I think, yeah, this is why, right? This is why right here.